Hi, I'm Hal Roberts. This is Bridge City News. Here's some of the top stories we've been following. An Alberta MLA reacts to the news that Casey Medu was stripped of his justice portfolio following a call Medu made to the Edmonton police chief. We hear from a Reeve in Lethbridge County who shares his concerns about the province potentially implementing a provincial police force. And the Betty White Challenge was a big success in Lethbridge. We have the numbers as to how much was raised for the local Humane Society.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Thanks so much for joining us. Casey Medu says he understands why Alberta Premier Jason Kenney relieved him of the justice portfolio after Medu made a phone call to Edmonton's police chief about a traffic ticket. Medu says he didn't call Chief Dale McPhee to get the $300 ticket cancelled, but he now understands why people have concerns about the call itself. Premier Kenney suspended Medu from his justice duties pending an investigation after the news report. Energy Minister Sonia Savage has taken on Medu's portfolio. Our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, joins us now from Edmonton to talk about this. Tyler, Casey Medu says he didn't call the Edmonton police chief to talk about the distracted driving ticket since he paid it. So then, why the call?
The reason that Medu gave was that he'd phoned regarding concerns about racial profiling and also concerns that perhaps he was being watched in a similar fashion to Shannon Phillips, the Lethbridge NDP MLA, who's had this sort of long-running conflict with the Lethbridge police service. But as you say, he claims that he didn't ask to have the ticket dismissed, and I believe the CBC had spoken to Chief McPhee, who had confirmed that. But of course, huge drama resulting of this because he is the justice minister. Therefore, he's sort of, the top lawman, in the province, phoning about to discuss a ticket that he got.
Thanks so much, Tyler. Tyler will also talk about why Alberta will never apparently follow Quebec's lead in implementing a potential tax for the unvaxxed. Those details coming up in the second half of our program. Drew Barnes is the MLA for Medicine Hat Cyprus. He joins us now from Medicine Hat. Drew, now you have a bit of a problem with Casey Medu calling the Edmonton police chief, even though Medu says the call was not about the distracted driving ticket. You see this as a severe conflict of interest?
Yeah, it's even worse. Time-honored Westminster parliamentary tradition that you do not interfere with a constituent's legal ongoings, never mind your own. And, clearly, that line was crossed. And for that reason, trust has been lost in the minister. Trust has been lost in the premier and the Kenney government again. And for that reason, I believe that Minister Medu should be removed from cabinet.
Now, Premier Kenney has called for an investigation into the matter. Is there any way back from this for MLA Medu?
Well, I'm surprised he's calling for an investigation. It's absolutely clear how the Edmonton police chief said that the Minister Medu called him. The minister admitted that he called him within minutes of getting the ticket. So what's left to investigate? A time-honored parliamentary tradition was broken, and the price for that, the repercussions are to lose your position.
Drew, during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Alberta government worked with Ottawa to create field hospitals to help when ICUs were overflowing with patients. Were they ever used? And what's going on with them now?
Oh, Hal, it's corporate welfare. It's the federal government at its worst. I think $300 million was pledged to SNC-Lavalin for 15 field hospitals. My understanding is 3 were built, and I don't think they were used. So, we've put our economy and our kids so deep in debt through these COVID lockdowns. This is just another part of insiders and cronyism benefiting, and, our kids and our economy having to carry the burden. And Hal, it's even deeper than that. If our provincial government would have surged capacity with the ICU beds, as they promised right at the start of the pandemic 2 years ago, instead of actually reducing the number of ICU beds, these things wouldn't have been needed at all.
The UCP Leadership Review is coming up this spring. What do you think will transpire? Is there anyone that could seriously challenge Jason Kenney for the party leadership?
Oh, absolutely. There's lots of good conservatives out there. There's lots of good people that would make excellent leaders for the Alberta people. And hey, let's let democracy decide. Let's let the people of Alberta decide. But Hal, it's clear Premier Kenney has lost the trust and the confidence of the vast majority of Albertans, and he shouldn't even wait for the leadership review. He should step aside.
Thanks so much, Drew. That was Medicine Hat Cyprus independent MLA Drew Barnes joining us from Medicine Hat. The Alberta government has discussed the potential of implementing a provincial police force which would replace the RCMP. Now, a report last year says the transition would cost around $366 million. In 2021, the Alberta government began shifting the cost of policing to municipalities. That resulted in a bill of over $350,000 for Lethbridge County to cover the policing. This year, that cost rose to $469,000. Reeve Tory Campbell from Lethbridge County says the municipality has some serious concerns about a potential transition to a provincial police force.
Our biggest concern, obviously, to this point is around the costing piece. The PricewaterhouseCoopers report really doesn't adequately address costing as far as we're concerned, as well as level of service and the overall impact that it would have to our municipality. We feel that we as a municipality have been underutilized, and we really haven't had the amount of conversation, and we feel like we've been left out of the conversation to this point. But I think even more importantly, I think the population of Alberta, the general public, has really been left out of that discussion.
The Alberta government has announced community engagement sessions coming up in early 2022 to allow for public input into the potential change. Now, the last time we had a provincial police force was from 1917 to 1932. The City of Lethbridge is looking into getting more flights in and out of our airport. Lethbridge City Council voted 7-2 to approve the city manager to discuss potential agreements with airlines regarding future options for passengers flying in and out of our city. Council approved the creation of a fund not to exceed $1 million to facilitate negotiations with any interested parties. In August of last year, Council voted to keep managing the Lethbridge Airport with a $500,000 net operating margin and a goal of having 150,000 annual passengers being achieved. Well, it was a little chilly in the Windy City today. Fortunately, a warming trend is on the way, which should melt a lot of the snow we received earlier this week. Jeanette Rocher is here now with an early look at the weather forecast. Jeanette, it may be a good time to stock up on windshield washer fluid once again.
Yeah, well, you wouldn't know it by looking out there today with all the -20 temperatures that we've been having. But yes, that all is about to change, Hal, as we are about to see things warm up significantly. So grab that windshield wiper fluid. You are going to need it because we're going to see a significant change in temperature from today's high of -9 only to tomorrow looking at a high of +5. And then the rest of the week, well, it's just going to keep on getting warmer. Wait till you see what we have in store for the weekend. I will have those details coming up for you later on in the newscast.
Looking forward to it. Thanks so much, Jeanette. The Betty White Challenge was a huge success here in our city. The Lethbridge and District Humane Society received lots of donations on January 17th in honor of the Hollywood actress and what would have been her 100th birthday. The Lethbridge and District Humane Society manager, Barb Grodzicki, says they had a pretty good turnout.
It was really great. They were pouring in all day. So by end of day, we had about $8,500. Once we calculated, we stopped calculating and then picked it up again. Donations are still coming in. So it was really good. People really responded to it and everybody was excited to be a part of it. I think it built an excitement and people just felt really good about it, and it was just because of Betty White.
Grodzicki says they would love to make this an annual challenge. A Southern Alberta man has decided to become a minimalist. Michael Bartz has created his own tiny home to limit his ecological hit on the planet. As Micah Quinn explains now, Bartz hopes to inspire others to rethink their own carbon footprint and downsize in a big way.
And this is my tiny home.
Michael Bartz's tiny home is off-grid and runs on solar power. Bartz saved $25,000 to put towards building the home, and he completed all of the work himself. During the construction, he put an additional $15,000 into the build.
I've got 3 190-watt panels on the roof, which actually I put on a hinge system, and that way it actually tracks the sun. So right now it's winter, and I'm getting pretty good sunshine right now, as opposed to if it was just flat on the roof. So we've got solar on the roof, and then it is mostly powered by propane as well.
The tiny home is 200 square feet, and Bartz says it took him 4 years to construct.
3 years part-time while working a full-time job in post-secondary, and then in 2020 I left that position and then kept building full-time Monday to Friday until I finished the build. So it's thousands of hours, lots of planning and working, but I did everything myself. My dad taught me to weld. He was a welder and a mechanic, and we built the trailer together, and then I started with the subfloor and the framing and the walls and everything else, on and on and on.
Bartz is also the creator of a podcast called In Over My Head. He won $10,000 in funding from TELUS Story Hive's podcast edition for the first season of his show.
And that came from the way I was feeling about lowering my environmental footprint and environmentalism generally, because I thought, okay, I'm going to build a tiny house, I'm going to reduce my environmental footprint, and that's a good thing. And so I built this tiny house. But then I thought about all the other ways that I have an impact on the environment, as far as transportation or the food I eat or where my things come from that I buy. And it felt very overwhelming. I felt in over my head. So I wanted to talk to experts who know more than I do about this topic.
Bart says as an environmentalist, he is trying to do his part to lower his environmental footprint, and he's hoping to empower others to do the same by living a more minimalist lifestyle. For Bridge City News, I'm Micah Quinn.
If you're interested in knowing more about the virtual world, Lethbridge College will be hosting Next Beyond the Metaverse virtual conference next month. It'll showcase some of the best virtual reality, augmented reality, and spatial technology, with experts explaining how to grow a business using the metaverse. Spokesperson Mike McCready says the conference will really give people a better understanding of what the virtual reality world is all about.
So what we want to do is to bring leaders from various companies and organizations to help companies and organizations in Southern Alberta and in Alberta be able to understand what the metaverse is, cut through the hype a little bit, and how can they start preparing for what's coming. We've used the comparison a lot that the metaverse is similar to when we were launching the internet in the early 90s. It's going to be quite a bit of a new adjustment in spatial computing or in computing, and how can companies prepare for that?
The conference will take place February 17th at the Spatial Technologies Applied Research Centre at the college. Gyms are being allowed to reopen in British Columbia. BC's Provincial Health Officer, Dr. Bonnie Henry, says, however, that other restrictions that went into place in December will remain in place for now.
Today, I'm taking the cautious step of reopening gyms and exercise facilities with capacity limits and the continued use of the BC vaccine card. These new guidelines have been developed, and we've been working very closely with the Fitness Industry Council of Canada, and I can't say enough about how responsive they have been to the needs of the fitness industry and the gyms, as also looking at the data that we have and working with us to put together new guidelines. And these will be in effect with the restart of gyms starting on January 20th. And that will include individual and group fitness, being able to resume at fitness centres and gyms across the province. Proof of vaccine will continue, of course, to be required at all locations. And we have limits that include a minimum of 7 meters square for every individual.
Ottawa signed an agreement with the Dakota TP First Nation in Manitoba to help guide potential unmarked gravesite investigations at former residential schools in 5 communities. They include Sandy Bay, Portage La Prairie, and Brandon. A survivor-led committee will search each of the sites, but also research records from the Catholic Church, Hudson's Bay Company, and the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. Chief Eric Pache calls the agreement historic for the Dakota people and says the time has come for their history to be properly told. Ontario's health minister says the province is seeing glimmers of hope in its fight against the Omicron variant of COVID-19. Christine Elliott says cases are expected to peak this month, with a peak in hospitalizations to follow.
The sacrifices you are making now have meant we are beginning to see signs of stabilization. Omicron cases are expected to peak this month, with a peak in hospitalizations and ICU admissions to follow. New hospitalizations are slowing and are now doubling closer to every 2 weeks. Experience in our hospitals has confirmed Omicron is not as severe as Delta, with far fewer patients requiring intensive care than in previous waves, despite much higher rates of transmission in the community.
1 person is dead and another 8 were injured, including 5 police officers and a suspected gas explosion and fire in the Bronx, New York. It was the second deadly fire in the region in less than 2 weeks.
Right now, we have 8 injured, 1 fatality. Our hearts go out to the family members of the lost lives, but clearly the action of FDNY and NYPD and residents, their quick response really allowed many that were a part of this crisis not to in some way be seriously injured or to die.
England will be ending all COVID passports, mask mandates, and work restrictions. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who called COVID an endemic, also suggested that self-isolation rules may be thrown out at the end of March. Also, there are reports that effective immediately, the United Kingdom and the government there is no longer asking people to work from home. The COVID pass mandate for nightclubs and large events will not be renewed when it expires on January 26th, and on the 27th, indoor mask wearing will also no longer be mandatory. Losing a child is devastating for most people, especially when you're planning a family. Jenny Albers wrote a book about how she lost a child through a miscarriage on more than one occasion. The name of the book is Courageously Expecting 30 Days of Encouragement for Pregnancy After Loss. Jenny says losing a baby can be devastating, and there are a lot of emotions a mother goes through.
I also think it's really important to acknowledge that there is grief woven into the pregnancy after loss experience, and that it's not all happiness and not all excitement and not all joy, and that it's actually really messy. And so I think acknowledging, say for me, if you were to acknowledge that my pregnancy after loss was really hard, or ask me how I'm doing, and not just assume that I'm planning for this beautiful future, that really helps me to feel seen, and it really helps me to feel understood.
Catch the full interview with author Jenny Albers of Courageously Expecting and BCN's Jeanette Rocher coming up in the second half of our newscast. Well, it appears as though we may be seeing a reprieve when it comes to the cooler winter temperatures. The mercury is going up by quite a bit. All of the weather details are coming up shortly. It was pretty chilly again today here in southwestern Alberta, but fortunately, warmer weather is on the way. Jeanette Rocher is back with all of the weather details. Jeanette, milder temperatures are just around the corner for us once again.
Yeah, well, you wouldn't know that a warming trend is about to hit us, judging by today's temperature, but the weather is about to significantly warm up overnight. Look at this. So high today was -9. Into tomorrow, we're going to be seeing those plus temperatures again, +5. Now, with the warmer temperatures also comes those Chinook winds. It almost seems like you can't have one without the other. So tomorrow, Thursday, we are looking at a southwest wind at 50 kilometers per hour. It's going to be gusting to 70 and even up to 90 kilometers per hour at times. Into Friday, we're seeing mainly sunny skies, high of 0. We're going to climb again on Saturday to 8. And look at that on Sunday. We are looking at double digits coming at us this weekend. Lots of sunshine on Sunday as well. Monday, partly cloudy skies, a high of 6 degrees and then a high of 10 again for next Tuesday. So once we get through today, we're in the clear here. We just got to brace ourselves for those Chinook winds again. Average high for this time of year, -2, -14 the average low. 17 was our high temperature on this day back in 1944. And in 1969, we hit our chilliest, which was -35. 8:20 is when the sun rose this morning and our sun set this evening, 5:05 p.m., giving us 8 hours and 40-ish minutes of daylight. So 2 minutes more daylight today than we had yesterday. Victoria, we're looking at some winds in the Juan de Fuca Straits up to 60 kilometers per hour, but periods of rain, 9 degrees the high. 9 the high for Vancouver as well, looking at a 40% chance of showers. Risk of freezing rain tomorrow in Edmonton with a high of 3 degrees and a high of 5 tomorrow in Calgary with a mix of sun and cloud. Now, some cold Arctic air is going to be rushing over the prairies overnight, bringing with it frigid wind chill. So we're looking at temperatures of -5 and -7 tomorrow in Saskatchewan and Regina, but it's going to feel more like -38 and -40 in those areas, including Winnipeg tomorrow. Now, Toronto, we're seeing a high of -11 tomorrow with a mix of sun and cloud, partly cloudy skies tomorrow. Also in Ottawa, -17 there, -12 the high tomorrow in Montreal with mainly sunny skies. Now over in Fredericton, we are seeing a chance of flurries, -1 the high, 6 degrees the high in Halifax. They are looking at rain changing to snow. Same thing for Charlottetown, looking at rain changing to snow by the afternoon with a high of 4 degrees. In St. John's, though, just the opposite. We're looking at snow changing to rain and could see up to 5 to 10 millimeters of rain there. 6 degrees the high and some winds as well. So there you have it. That is your forecast.
Canada's annual inflation rate hit a 30-year high last month at 4.8%, but economists warn that it may go even higher this year. Stats Canada says the increase in consumer prices was driven by higher costs for food, passenger vehicles, and housing. It's the 9th straight month that headline inflation has come in above the Bank of Canada's target zone of between 1% and 3%. Economists say it could grind even higher before cooling off in the spring due to rising energy prices, supply chain issues, and a jump in housing prices. A Saskatchewan farmer is the new president of the Agricultural Producers Association of Saskatchewan. Ian Boxall was elected Tuesday at the organization's annual general meeting in Regina. Boxall had been one of the two of the farm group's vice presidents and represented the rural municipality of Connaught. He takes over from Todd Lewis, who completed the maximum 6-year term as president. Barrick Gold says it produced 4.44 million ounces of gold last year. That is the low end of its guidance of between 4.4 and 4.7 million ounces. It says preliminary copper production of 415 million pounds for 2021 was within its guidance range of 410 to 460 million pounds. The Canadian Mining Company says early results show production in its fourth quarter totaled 1.2 million ounces of gold and 126 million pounds of copper. Now, here's a look at today's markets. The TSX was down 69 points in the day to 21,205. The Dow was down 339 points to 35,028. The S&P 500 was down 44 points to 4532. And the Nasdaq was down 166 points on the day to 14,340. West Texas Intermediate Oil was up 82 cents to 86.25 US per barrel. Natural gas was down 26 cents to 4.02 US. Gold was up 15 cents to 18.4069 US an ounce, and silver was up a cent to 24.14 US an ounce. Feed wheat is at $12.11 per bushel. Barley's at $9.58. Canola's at $22.09, and corn is at $10.57 per bushel. Live cattle were up 88 cents to $138.43. Feeder cattle were down 5 cents to $161.40, and lean hogs were up 70 cents to $82.30. The Canadian dollar was up slightly over the past 24 hours to $79.92 US. Recapping one of our top stories, the City of Lethbridge is looking into getting more flights in and out of our airport. Lethbridge City Council voted 7-2 to approve the city manager to discuss potential agreements with airlines regarding future options for passengers flying in and out of our city. Council approved the creation of the fund not to exceed $1 million to facilitate negotiations with any interested parties. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney has brought in an investigator to look into a potential conflict of interest when Casey Medu called the Edmonton police chief after receiving a distracted driving ticket. Our legislative reporter Tyler Dawson will have more details for us in just a moment.
Here's today's Bridge City News Community Calendar. The Lethbridge Senior Citizens Organization is looking for volunteers to take part in their Drive Happiness program. This program is to help seniors in our community who are facing extreme loneliness due to lack of accessible transportation. Volunteers will drive clients to their medical appointments, pick up groceries, and take them to important life activities. If you're interested in this opportunity and for more information, call 403-332-4320 or email volunteer@volunteerlethbridge.com. Come and enjoy Nikayuko Japanese Garden's annual Winter Light Festival, open from 6 to 10 p.m. Wednesday to Sunday until February 28th. Bundle up and take in the massive light display, ice sculptures, and other features throughout the garden. Discover Japanese customs and traditions that are celebrated during the winter months. To purchase advance tickets and for information on COVID protocols, visit nikayuko.com. And that's your Bridge City News Community Calendar.
Now, a big story that many in our province have been talking about is how Casey Medu has been stripped of his duties as Justice Minister and Solicitor General after receiving a distracted driving ticket, then calling the Edmonton Police Chief. To discuss this in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Tyler, Medu says he didn't call the Edmonton Police Chief, McPhee, to talk about the $300 ticket, so why the call?
Well, it's a great question. And the reason that Madhu gave was that he'd phoned regarding concerns about racial profiling and also concerns that perhaps he was being watched in a similar fashion to Shannon Phillips, the Lethbridge NDP MLA, who's had this sort of long-running conflict with the Lethbridge police service. But as you say, he claims that he didn't ask to have the ticket dismissed, and I believe the CBC had spoken to Chief McPhee, who had confirmed that. But of course, huge drama resulting of this because he is the Justice Minister. Therefore, he's sort of the top lawman in the province, phoning about to discuss a ticket that he got. So big drama that broke this week, and he has, as you mentioned, been sort of pushed back from his role as Justice Minister. Sonia Savage, the Energy Minister, is stepping in to fulfill his duties. And there's also an independent investigation going on that will, I guess, determine whether or not there was sort of any inappropriate conduct on Minister Madhu's, well, no longer minister, I suppose, on Casey Madhu's part in this affair.
Yeah, Premier Kenney, like you said, he mentioned that Energy Minister Sonia Savage temporarily taking over that portfolio, Justice Minister and Solicitor General. That's a lot on her plate.
Yeah, she's a busy minister, and probably I think the busiest minister now probably in the entire cabinet. It sort of makes you think of Chrystia Freeland at the federal liberal level, who seemed to have like every job in cabinet for a period of time there.
Now, you said that the independent investigator will be brought in to look into this case. What will the investigator specifically be looking for?
Well, I think basically just whether or not there was any sort of breach of this sort of divide between politics and the law. Obviously it's not an option for any of us to phone up the police chief if we got a ticket. So there will be, I think, some questions about whether or not there's anything inappropriate about that phone call. And I think probably whether or not Casey Madhu is going to be able to defend making that phone call, even if he was going to be discussing other things, not sort of directly related to his ticket. And I should say there's no sort of timeline on this. And so I do expect we'll hear a little bit more of it here and there as this sort of goes on.
So do you think there's actually a way back for Casey Madhu to once again become Solicitor General and the Justice Minister?
Well, I think probably. And the reason for that has less to do with sort of this independent investigation and more to do, I suspect, with the fact that he's the only UCP cabinet minister and perhaps only UCP MLA from Edmonton. And so that makes him, sort of a very integral part of the Kenney cabinet. And also, I think probably in, a year's time, the Kenney re-election campaign to have had a cabinet minister in Edmonton. So I think if you set aside the investigation and the sort of ethics of the matter, I think the politics probably suggest that he's the sort of guy you want to have back in cabinet as soon as possible.
Now, Tyler, some good news during the COVID-19 pandemic. Even though there are around 70,000 active cases here of the virus in the province, unlike previous waves, this one hasn't been quite as dire with Omicron. Schools have been open, but the NDP is calling for more to be done to protect our students in schools, as a child recently died this week from COVID-19.
Yes, there's sort of a lot happening on the COVID front, but as you sort of mentioned, not quite sort of as dire or dramatic as it was back in the Delta wave. 70,000 active cases is like about triple, I would say, the number of cases we had in the Delta wave. Hospitalizations around 100, 1,000, I should say, and about 100 in ICU. So big numbers, but we're not quite hearing the same sort of stuff about hospital collapse that we were just months ago. On the school front, obviously, the Alberta government chose to go back to in-person learning a little bit more quickly than some other provincial governments did, Ontario being sort of the big example. And there were concerns that, whether there are going to be enough teachers, whether or not people are going to be sick. And obviously there are plenty of teachers who have fallen ill. There are students who have fallen ill. But otherwise it seems to more or less be working. The NDP, of course, saying that N95 masks should be sent to students. There should be more rapid testing kits. There has been a little bit of drama on that front. It's some schools not receiving them, stuff like that. The NDP also saying, it's not too late for more HEPA filters in classrooms. So, it's still some politics happening around the Omicron variant, but some hint in sort of wastewater data and things like that we may be maybe not quite over the hump, but approaching it anyways.
Health Minister Jason Copping also has COVID-19. What's the status of his condition?
he is in self-isolation with mild symptoms. And, he's actually not really the only prominent politician who's caught it either. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe tested positive, I think, last week and is also isolating. So, I think it just goes to show that the virus is everywhere right now.
Now, the province has been pushing for Albertans to receive their third dose of the COVID-19 vaccine. But Tyler, a third dose is not necessary for the restriction exemption program to get into like gyms and restaurants.
That's right. And, I'd asked the health minister about that earlier this month, with this big push, with the 2 doses being less effective as compared to the 3 doses, whether or not that was going to change. And Jason Copping didn't totally take it off the table. This is something we'll be thinking about, talking about in the future. But it's just notable, I think, that they haven't moved to include a third dose yet. And, I don't actually think any province in Canada has. And certainly the federal government hasn't moved to third doses for things like air travel or train travel. But that's just another thing I'm sort of keeping my eye on as the pandemic goes on and the science shifts a little bit, whether or not that third dose is going to become even more critical for some of these sort of public spaces, I guess.
And a lot of people are actually quite concerned about that, including a lot of my family. A third dose, then a fourth dose, and a fifth dose. Tyler, when will it end?
Well, and it's interesting you bring that up because on Tuesday, I think it was, the province announced that fourth doses were going to be opened up for immunocompromised patients. And some other countries, Israel, I think, had done that some weeks ago, maybe a couple months ago. So you're right. It is, I think, an open question a little bit when this is going to end. And my assumption, I think, is that you're going to have less and less uptake on every new dose that comes out. So it also becomes, a public health messaging issue, I think, for the government. So we'll see how it goes, I suppose, in the weeks ahead.
Tyler, many Albertans are celebrating the fact that the UCP will not tax the unvaxxed, similar to what Quebec Premier Francois Legault has proposed. Kenny has reiterated that Alberta gave up the power it had in legislation that would have allowed for mandatory vaccination. So no tax for the unvaxxed here in our province.
No, but not to raise the specter, but they've also said there was never going to be a vaccine passport system. And of course, we now have one. But no, you're right that the government did give up that power. It was sort of buried in sort of the public health legislation and gave this power, I think, to the chief medical officer of health to sort of mandate vaccination. Of course, it didn't spell out how that would happen. Quebec's mandatory vaccination is essentially a tax. That's what other countries in Europe have done. We don't have, jackbooted police officers going door to door to inject people. But Kenny, I think very strongly, probably the most strongly of any of the premiers in the country, saying that this simply is not a thing that's going to happen in Alberta. And it, of course, would be hugely controversial, I think, if it was to be done here. So I think it's probably safe to say for the time being that is off the table. And we'll have to see how that plays out in Quebec, of course, because they haven't actually tabled legislation on it yet. So who knows, maybe the crisis will pass and they'll back down on it or something like that. And no other province at this point really seriously talking about it. But, earlier this month, Jean-Yves Duclos, the federal health minister, saying that, he thinks this is going to be something provinces will have to discuss. So probably not something we're going to see here, but I think certainly worth keeping an eye on.
Alberta's monitoring the vaccination requirements for truckers and what impact that will have on the province. Tyler, we receive a lot of our goods from the United States in the backs of trucks, so this is a pretty important issue.
It is. Something like 30% of Alberta's goods are carried around on the back of a truck. And actually, Premier Jason Kenney sort of tweeting on Wednesday morning that this federal policy risks making goods more expensive for Albertans. So that's, I think, maybe the closest we've actually come in the last little bit to let's say, a criticism of this federal government policy, which, of course, was subject to this very strange flip-flop last week where they said, oh, no, we're not going to require vaccination. And then, 24 hours later, 18 hours later, they said, no, we're actually going to require vaccination. So a bit of a strange situation politically, and lots of truckers, lots of trucking associations really saying that this could have some substantial supply chain impacts. So the Alberta government monitoring it has not officially, let's say, come out and criticized it, but we're hearing more and more about inflation. People are worried about grocery store shelves. So this, I think, is a political issue that is going to endure for a little while, I would imagine, and possibly also be sort of a provincial federal source of some tension, I would imagine, since the border, of course, is not within our control. That would be the federal government.
You know, like you said, when the federal government flip-flopped on the vaccination for the truckers, that made it a bit of a challenge for us here. I mean, the 5 o'clock we said, you know, at first that, you know, you don't have to worry about the truckers being vaccinated. Then for the 11 o'clock update, 11 p.m., we said, no, it's actually the vaccine mandate's in place here. So when the government flip-flopped, we had to make sure that we got the most relevant, pertinent information and up-to-date information to our viewers. But how about in print media? It's a little more challenging for you guys, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, the paper only comes out every 24 hours, but, you know, at least we can update on the web. But it is, I mean, this is digressing a little bit, but it is, you know, this major communications screw up on the part of the federal government, because somehow all these journalists heard one thing and it turned out to be wrong. And so there was wrong information circulating for quite a period of time. And that's not good for anyone.
Tyler, a UCP and NDP committee is studying the idea of a safe drug supply. How would that work? First of all, the fact that they're working together, that's a miracle in itself.
Well, you know, it's very interesting that they're doing this, because, you know, I'd had some conversations with some UCP people who are sort of adamantly opposed to this idea. And it basically works like this. The idea is that people are dying from drug overdoses, not necessarily because they're using drugs, but because the drugs they are using are toxic or are far more potent than they expected, things like that. So that's part of the logic behind a supervised injection site. If they overdose on this unexpectedly powerful drug, someone can be there to help them. So the safe drug supply essentially would be distributing safe quantities of heroin, for example, to users that they know is less likely to kill them. So this committee is studying the idea, and there's obviously major ideological divides on this. The New Democrats favoring things like supervised injection sites. The UCP has been more, well, they've been more conservative on drug issues in the province. And it sort of kicked off on Tuesday, I think it was, with this strange debate. They wanted to have this they brought forward this motion that said they were going to remember before each meeting, you know, all the people who died of drug poisoning. And the UCP said, oh, no, we want to talk about all the people who died of drug addiction. There's, you know, back and forth ideologically between the two camps, and I think they agreed in the end to say both. But it does sort of show with this little spat that there is this pretty substantial ideological and political divide on how to approach this issue. So it's going to be very, very interesting to see what they come back with, I think.
The Alberta Court of Appeal will hear a case regarding ID at supervised injection sites, Tyler. The UCP put rules in place that users need to present their identification and a health card to use the sites, but opponents say, you know what, many drug users simply don't have ID.
That's right. So the debate is sort of whether or not this is, as the UCP says, a way to connect them with better resources, more healthcare, or as the sort of New Democrats would say, whether this is going to restrict access. So there's a couple groups that had gone to a lower court to get an injunction to delay the implementation of this. It goes into effect January 31st. They lost, actually, at the lower court, and they've since appealed it. Normally, these things take quite a while to get from a lower court to a higher court, but the Court of Appeal is sort of rushing this urgently. So it will hear this case on January 27th, I believe it is, on whether or not this rule can come into effect like 4 days later.
Now, we've chatted in the past about separatist parties and whether or not they're going to make a splash. Tyler, there's another one now. It's called Alberta Statehood Party. What do we know about these guys?
Yeah, so it's led by a guy named Glenn Carrott, who people might remember him as one of the main organizers behind the United We Roll convoy that went to Ottawa in 2019, I think it was, protesting oil and gas policy that the federal government had brought in. And so since then, he's sort of been around in sort of right-wing political circles. He was involved with a lot of those other protests around the time. He's been a very, very vocal anti-COVID policy critic, I would say. And he also had a failed run to be the mayor of Innisfail. So sort of circulating in central Alberta politics for a period of time. And he's now the leader of this party. And its objective basically is that Alberta should separate and join the United States. So not necessarily an independence party, but you know, we should become an American state, which of course is an idea that's circulated for a long, long time. Yeah, there's another player, I guess, on the right in Alberta.
Wow. Alberta becoming the 51st state. Not sure if I would buy into that. Tyler, the province is looking into controversial changes that would make it more difficult to fight traffic tickets. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, very interesting policy in the wake of Casey Madhu getting a distracted driving ticket, I'd have to say. And the way it would basically work is you won't be able to go to traffic court for a ticket. You'll have like 7 days or something like that to decide whether or not you're going to fight the ticket. There's a fee associated with this. and it will be done either over the phone or online with an adjudicator. So critics are saying, well, this is a end run around due process. Why should people not be able to go to court to fight these things? Saying that it's going to prevent people from fighting tickets that they think were unjust. And the other thing that's come up in a couple of the news reports is there's a lot of small businesses sort of dedicated to helping people fight these traffic tickets. A lot of former and retired police officers, for example, run these businesses, saying that this is really going to cause problems for their business model. So very strange policy and sort of done quite quietly. But another thing that I assume is going to be controversial in the future, and I would speculate, if I can do that the courts surely are going to take notice of something like this.
The next time we have a conversation, I want to chat with you more about photo radar. We got to get that under control
yes.
as well. And the cash cow that's become. Our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, thanks for your time today.
Always a pleasure, Hal.
It's always such exciting news when parents announce that they're expecting, but for anyone who has experienced the loss of a baby through a miscarriage or a stillbirth, this is not only traumatic at the time, but it can add a dimension of fear and anxiety in any future pregnancy. Today's guest has some hope to share on this subject. Jenny Elbers is the author of Courageously Expecting 30 Days of Encouragement for Pregnancy After Loss. Welcome to Bridge City News, Jenny. So glad to have you on today to share your story with us.
Thank you.
All right. So, Jenny, you yourself experienced a normal, healthy pregnancy with your first child and then planned to go on to have more children, never considering that a subsequent pregnancy might not go so well. So maybe can you tell us your story?
Yeah. So, my first pregnancy was my pregnancy with my daughter. Perfect pregnancy, textbook, no concerns, joyful, excited, couldn't wait. We had a plan. We were going to have 3 children. We wanted them 3 years apart. The timing seemed to almost be worked out when our first loss occurred, which was an ectopic pregnancy very early on in our pregnancy. And then 1 year later, we had a stillbirth, which was our 3rd pregnancy. So we had 2 losses. And then a year after that, we were pregnant again and just very fearful as to what the outcome would be.
Well, that's understandable and I'm sure very normal. So you were saying your 3rd pregnancy resulted in the stillbirth, and that was your son, Micah, at just over 20 weeks, right? So how did the loss of Micah change you?
Well, I mean, at first it felt like it completely broke me. I was crushed. The grief was very heavy, very raw. I felt like I didn't really fit in, especially with other moms. I did have a daughter already, so I was very visibly a mother and visibly and physically parenting. But I'm trying to think of a good way to describe it. I felt so broken, and it was really hard to watch other families grow while mine didn't. It also helped me to see other people's pain and heartache, and that it helped me to realize that so often those things are invisible and we can't see them. So even, with my daughter, I was a happy parent, right? I was a happy mom. She was beautiful. I loved her. But people, as time went on, people couldn't see kind of the pain that had played into my motherhood.
Yeah.
And then after becoming pregnant again for a 4th time, again, I felt almost like I didn't fit in and I felt invisible because I was pregnant and it was a happy time, but there was so much grief behind that.
Yeah.
And so I think, all of those things are related specifically to motherhood, but I think it just gave me a level of compassion that I didn't have before. And then also related to pregnancy, how it changed that was I didn't feel so naive anymore, right? Like I knew that pregnancies could go wrong, whereas I didn't really know that before. And I think you kind of do have to experience it to really understand.
I think you're right. Absolutely. I mean, how traumatic too, because anyone who knows gestation knows that a normal pregnancy is about 40 weeks. So losing your baby at 20 weeks, you're halfway through. That's got to be about 4.5, 5 months in. So that's a big
Right.
chunk of your pregnancy. So
And having to tell people.
yes. How devastating for you. I'm so sorry that you went through that. But after losing Micah, how did you and your husband go about making the decision to try again? I would imagine it would be a scary decision.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would say it was a combination of things. One, time. My doctor's recommendations were to wait 6 months. And kind of like I write about in the book, for physical healing, but I also think for like emotional healing and healing of your heart, because it was just so crushing. So we did wait that 6 months. However, after that, we waited for longer than that officially, but we waited that 6 months. And then, I met with specialists and I had consultations with high risk doctors, lots of research, lots of, making sure that I was doing for my body everything I could. Though I know that nothing was guaranteed, I wanted to make sure that I felt comfortable in the space that I was physically. And so a lot of that did involve consultation with doctors. And then ultimately, it came to the realization that we weren't ever really going to feel safe, right? Like it was never going to feel like the perfect time or this time is going to be it. And so it was a combination of all of those things of just being like, the time is now. It's never going to feel really good. So let's jump in.
Yeah, exactly. And then once you had your fourth pregnancy, that child came out healthy?
Yes. Yep. He is my son.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you talked about going through so much of a learning curve almost, if you want to even put it in those terms. I hate to use that for pregnancies, but what are some of the biggest lessons that you learned while going through that fourth pregnancy?
Yeah. One of the biggest ones is that being pregnant after loss and just kind of that season of life is very misunderstood by most people. So they see the healthy, well, we want to assume that it's a healthy pregnancy. They see a pregnancy or they know about your pregnancy and they are excited for you and they are waiting in anticipation for a baby to arrive. But you yourself aren't exactly waiting for that. Not only are you grieving previous pregnancies, you are fearful and you're anxious that you're going to be grieving another loss. And I think I've never thought so much about, pregnancy or pregnant women needing to be supported other than, in a doctor's office or things like that.
Sure.
But we really do need so much support when we're pregnant after loss, because not only is there the physical aspect to it, but there's the emotional aspect. And in some ways that can be harder, right, than the physical aspect. And so I just learned how pregnancy is viewed, generally through society, and how pregnancy after loss is kind of missed. And, it's different than a normal pregnancy. And I also learned how much I needed both support and encouragement from other people, but also I needed them to kind of sit in that middle with me, where grief is on one side and hope is on the other side, where loss is on one side and the potential for life is on the other side. I needed people to sit there with me in the encouragement, but also in the hardship of the situation.
Wow. I was actually just going to ask you, how can people be more sensitive to the needs of those who are pregnant again after experiencing a loss such as that?
Yeah, a couple things. I think one is definitely support in tangible ways. And those are some of the ways that we often think of supporting people, right? Like meals, childcare. I I think some of the ways are some of the ways that we would support someone who's grieving, giving them options of I can drop off groceries, I can bring a meal, I can pick up a child, which one works for you. So something tangible. I also think it's really important to acknowledge that there is grief woven into the pregnancy after loss experience, and that it's not all happiness and not all excitement and not all joy, and that it's actually really messy. And so I think acknowledging, say for me, if you were to acknowledge that my pregnancy after loss was really hard, or ask me how I'm doing, and not just assume that I'm planning for this beautiful future, that really helps me to feel seen, and it really helps me to feel understood, and not so isolated. The other thing is that we can feel isolated because we don't feel like we quite fit in with pregnant women, right? And so I think just verbally acknowledging that it's a really hard season and offering tangible ways to help. Those would be my two biggest pieces of advice.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Jenny, and especially for people who haven't gone through it. It is so hard to imagine what the person is going through. What are some of the emotions that women often experience during pregnancy after a loss, or even after the loss itself?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, grief definitely plays in. And I think that's not just grief of former pregnancies and grieving your babies. Obviously, that's part of it. But there's also grief over the loss of a normal pregnancy and grief over the loss of feeling safe during your pregnancy. And so grief shows up in different ways during pregnancy after loss, and some that we wouldn't normally think of as, a reason to grieve. I think fear, we're always kind of on edge and always waiting for something to go wrong. Anxiety goes along with fear, just constantly wondering what's next and am I going to get to keep this baby?
Absolutely, absolutely. Is it possible for moms to find joy in their pregnancy, even while still going through that grieving process?
Yeah, I think it is. It's probably easier said than done. And it's not something that I feel that I did particularly well. But I think it is something that you have to intentionally seek moment to moment. I think you have to look at the small milestones. Maybe that's, I made it to 10 weeks or I made it to 12 weeks. Some of that kind of depends on your personal story and when your losses occurred and things like that. But celebrating the small milestones, celebrating each day that you're a day closer to a successful pregnancy. So I think it's possible. I'm not sure that it's possible to feel that way all the time. That was my experience. And I've talked to so many women who have experienced this. And so I don't think anyone has said, I felt great and joyful the entire time. But I think we can seek it from moment to moment.
Mm-hmm. That's really great encouragement. Now, what would you say to someone who may want to try to have more children, but they're filled with doubt and fear?
Yeah. Well, I would say that's very normal. And I would validate their feelings. But I also like to encourage people to look at it. Can be painful to see other women pregnant, right? It can be painful to see newborn babies. It can be painful to see families growing when yours doesn't look like how you thought it would. However, I think we can also find hope in those things, that pregnancy is supposed to be kind of a normal part of life, right? And it's hard to look at it that way when you've experienced loss. But when we see other successful pregnancies, I think that can bring us hope that it is possible. I say it's hard to get out of the way of fear, right, or push it aside. But I think we miss out on so much when we get stuck in that place of fear. I think it's okay to ask the question of what if we tried again, right? What if something went the right way next time?
Yeah.
I think we have to really cling to hope when we aren't sure.
Definitely.
That
Yeah.
there's a reason to hope.
Now, Jenny, you have a chapter about choosing God over Google. So it's often our instinct, right, to look up everything online. Then we often end up adding to our burden by doing that. So how can moms to be balanced, educating themselves and also trusting God?
Yeah, number one, that was probably one of my biggest problems. And so I think some practical ways are setting time limits. I'm not suggesting to never look at Google. I think like now that we have that technology, that's just what we do. But I think setting healthy boundaries around that is really important. I found myself searching for the same things over and over, kind of in hopes that I would find the answer that I wanted. That never happened. And so, in those times of obsessing, it's healthy to turn it off and instead pray, or instead listen to worship music, or instead, read scripture, or whatever that looks like for you. But to somehow break the cycle of obsessing over it. And I think, the internet was super helpful for me in that I could connect and be supported by so many other women who had experienced loss, which I didn't have in my regular life. And so that was healthy and that was helpful. But Google can be super negative, right, in so many ways.
Totally.
And so when you get in that cycle, break it, whatever that looks like.
Yeah.
And also talk to your healthcare providers. I know that it's easy for us to go to a doctor's appointment and then come home and look up obsessively everything that they said. But I think it's important that we are open with our healthcare providers, because ultimately they're the ones who are there and who are caring for us and who need to know what's going on. Whereas Google, isn't reliable.
Thanks so much for sharing your story with us today, Jenny. Really appreciate having you on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. All the best to you and your family. Jenny Elbers is the author of Courageously Expecting 30 Days of Encouragement for Pregnancy After Loss. It is available at www.jennyelbers.com. That's ALBERS, Elbers. So great to have her on today. I'm Jeanette Roche on behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News. Thanks for watching.